Leopold Loika. The wrong turn that helped trigger World War I. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was visiting Sarajevo. What is interesting is that earlier that day, assassins had already tried to kill him with a bomb, but the bomb missed his car and injured other people instead. Later that day, Ferdinand decided to continue with his visit, and because of the wounded from the earlier attack, he decided he wanted to go to the hospital to see them. However, Leopold Loika, who was his driver, was not properly informed about the changed route, or at least there was confusion around where the car was supposed to go. So the car turned onto the wrong street, and at some point, it stopped. And by pure chance, one of the failed assassins, Gavrilo Princip, was nearby. When Princip saw Franz Ferdinand and his wife, he immediately shot both of them in cold blood. That assassination became the spark that helped ignite World War I. Now, to be clear, the wrong turn did not single-handedly cause the war. Europe was already full of tension. Alliances, nationalism, militarism, imperial rivalry, and political instability. But that accidental turn created the exact moment where the assassination succeeded. And that assassination triggered a chain reaction that pulled country after country into war. World War I helped collapse empires, redraw borders, create new political movements, destabilize Europe, and set the stage for even more conflict later. All of that happened because of one accidental turn, and it shows how one tiny decision can have a massive impact on history. After that moment, the world was never the same. Number 2. Alexander Fleming. The mold that changed medicine. Alexander Fleming was a Scottish doctor and bacteriologist whose work focused on infections and how the body fights bacteria. In 1928, Fleming returned to his lab and noticed something unusual. One of his bacterial culture plates had been contaminated by mold. Now, most scientists would see that as a big problem because contamination ruins the experiment. However, Fleming noticed something strange. The bacteria around the mold had disappeared, which suggested that the mold was producing something that stopped the bacteria from growing. That substance later became known as penicillin, one of the most important discoveries in medical history. Before antibiotics, bacterial infections that seem treatable today could be deadly. A small wound, a bad infection, childbirth complications, or pneumonia. Any of these could become life-threatening. Penicillin changed modern medicine and helped save millions of lives. It also transformed how doctors treated bacterial disease. And the craziest part is that it started with what looked like a ruined experiment. Instead of throwing the contaminated plate away, Fleming had the curiosity to look closer. And because of that, one accident became a discovery that millions of people might not be alive without today. Number 3, we have Wilhelm Röntgen, the accidental discovery of the X-ray. Röntgen was a German physicist who was studying cathode rays and vacuum tubes in 1895. And while he was working in his lab, he noticed something strange. Even though his equipment was covered with black cardboard, a nearby screen started glowing. Now that should not have been happening, because if the tube was covered, then whatever was inside should not have been affecting anything outside of it. However, Röntgen realized that something invisible was passing through the covering and reaching the screen. So he kept testing it, and what he discovered was a completely new kind of ray, something that could pass through certain materials. Because he did not fully know what it was at first, he called it an X-ray. And what is interesting is that this one strange glow in a lab changed medicine almost immediately. For the first time, doctors had a practical way to see inside the human body without cutting it open. Broken bones, bullets, objects trapped under the skin, things that were once hidden could now be seen. Suddenly, the invisible became visible. Röntgen noticed something strange, followed it, and that strange glow became something millions of people still depend on today. Number 4. Stanislav Petrov, the false alarm that prevented nuclear war. On September 26, 1983, during the Cold War, Petrov was on duty at a Soviet early warning command center. Then the system reported something terrifying. It claimed that the United States had launched a missile toward the Soviet Union. Then it reported more missiles after that. Imagine being in that room. The screen says nuclear missiles are coming. The Cold War is already tense. One wrong move could trigger retaliation, and retaliation could trigger nuclear war. But Petrov noticed something strange. If the United States was actually launching a first strike, why would it only send a few missiles? A real nuclear attack would probably be massive. So instead of fully trusting the warning system, Petrov judged it as a false alarm. And he was right. The system had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for missile launches. That is what makes this one accident so terrifying. The system was wrong. But at that moment, Petrov had to decide whether to trust the machine or trust his judgment. And that decision may have helped stop a false alarm from becoming something much worse. At number 5, we have Charles Goodyear, the accident that made rubber useful. Charles Goodyear was an American inventor who became obsessed with trying to improve rubber. And the reason this mattered is because early rubber had a big problem. In hot weather, it became sticky and soft. In cold weather, it became stiff and cracked. So even though people knew rubber could be useful, it was hard to depend on. Goodyear spent years trying to fix this, and honestly, his life was a mess during that time. He struggled with money, debt, and failure. But he kept experimenting anyway. Then, in 1839, something strange happened. While working with rubber mixed with sulfur, the material accidentally touched a hot stove, and instead of becoming useless, it changed. It became tougher, stronger, and more resistant to temperature. That process became known as vulcanization. And what is interesting is that this one accident helped turn rubber into something the modern world could actually use. Without vulcanized rubber, you do not get the same kind of tires, factory belts, shoes, hoses, and so many everyday products that people barely think about. Rubber went from being unreliable to becoming one of the most important materials in industry. Number 6, we have Percy Spencer, the experiment that led to the microwave. Percy Spencer was an American engineer who worked at Raytheon, and in the 1940s he was working with radar technology. Specifically, he was working around magnetrons, which are devices that produce microwave radiation. And then one day, something weird happened. A candy bar in his pocket started melting. Now, most people would probably just be confused and move on. Maybe they would think, okay, that was strange, and then forget about it. However, Spencer noticed that the equipment near him was giving off energy that could heat food. So he started testing it. He tried popcorn, and the kernels popped. Then he tested an egg. And according to the famous story, the egg exploded during the experiment. And that is when the idea became serious. Because Spencer realized this was not just a random weird moment. If microwave energy could heat a candy bar, pop popcorn, and cook an egg, then maybe it could be used to cook food on purpose. That eventually led to the microwave oven. And what is interesting is that today, most of us do not even think about it. We just put food in, press a button, and wait. But the microwave changed everyday life. It changed kitchens. It changed dorm rooms. It changed workplaces. It changed how people reheated food, prepared quick meals, and thought about convenience. Before that, heating food usually took more time. You needed a stove, an oven, or a pan. But the microwave made food faster and easier in a way that became normal for millions of people. And all of that started because a candy bar melted in the wrong place at the right time. At number 7, we have George de Mestral, the invention of Velcro. George de Mestral was a Swiss engineer, and his story starts in the most normal way possible. He went outside for a walk with his dog. And when he came back, he noticed that burrs were stuck to his clothes and his dog's fur. Now, most people would just pull them off, get annoyed, and move on with their day. However, de Mestral became curious about why they were sticking so well. So instead of ignoring it, he looked at the burrs under a microscope. And that is when he noticed something interesting. The burrs were covered in tiny hooks, and those hooks were grabbing onto the loops in fabric and fur. So what looked like a random annoying thing from nature was actually a really smart design, and that gave him an idea. What if he could copy that same hook and loop system and turn it into something useful? That idea eventually became Velcro, also known as hook and loop fasteners. And what is interesting is that Velcro sounds simple, but it became useful in so many different places. Shoes, jackets, bags, even spacesuits. It is not as dramatic as nuclear war or antibiotics, but it still changed everyday life in a real way. Because sometimes, history does not change through a giant disaster or a massive scientific breakthrough. Sometimes it changes because one person notices something annoying and actually asks, why does this work so well? At number 8, we have James Marshall, the gold discovery that triggered a rush. In 1848, James Marshall was working at Sutter's Mill in California, near the American River. He was helping build a sawmill for John Sutter, and part of his job was checking the water channel that helped power the mill. Then one morning, while looking through the channel, he noticed something shiny in the water. They were small flakes, but they caught his attention. Marshall picked them up, and they turned out to be gold. At first, the people around Sutter's Mill tried to keep the discovery quiet because they knew it could bring chaos. But news like that does not stay secret for long. Once word started spreading, California changed fast. People from across the United States and around the world rushed there hoping to get rich. These people became known as the 49ers because so many arrived in 1849. Small settlements grew into busy towns. Businesses opened to serve the miners. Roads, ports, farms, and supply systems expanded because so many people were arriving at once. San Francisco especially exploded in size, becoming one of the most important cities on the West Coast. This became the California Gold Rush. And what is interesting is that Marshall himself did not become rich from the discovery. The gold brought crowds, conflict, and pressure onto the land around him. But it did not give him the fortune people would expect.